And now we will move on to our next session. So I'd like to invite Richard Irving and Bill Tai to join us. Richard is the founder and managing partner of Pond Venture Partners. He is also a venture advisor to Samsung. He will lead the next session on the importance and opportunity of building solutions to global problems. And he will be in conversation with the co-founder of XTC, amongst other things, Bill Tai. Richard, all yours.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Appreciate the kind introduction. Bill, it's great to see you. And just a quick introduction from me. Bill Tai has been funding startups since 1991, both directly as an angel investor and as a partner of Charles River Ventures. He has had 22 of his companies become listed companies, from being the first employee of TSMC in the US to the first investor in startups including Zoom, Canva, Color Genomics, Safety Culture, TweetDeck, Twitter, and Wish.com. Bill's experience spans every stage from startup to global tech giant, and in many regions of the world as well. He serves on the World Economic Forum's Technology Pioneer Committee and co-founded XTC. So I think there's a wealth of experience here for the startups on this call to hear, and I would encourage all of you to be thinking of questions to ask Bill. I'll ask a few to get us going here. Bill, again, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for taking time out to be able to get on the call here. So our session's entitled Importance and Opportunity of Building Solutions to Global Problems. You know, the subtitle of XTC, the way I see it, is sort of tech for good. You know, how do you take technology and somehow use it to make the world a better place? How do you think about tech for good? I mean, you're a co-founder of XTC. It seems like an incredibly important mission.
Yeah, it's been an evolution. You know, when I started in technology, I was trained originally as a semiconductor chip designer, and I sort of saw the world evolve from the inside out. And in the very beginning, most of the people in technology really only created technology products for other technology companies to try to make hardware products a little bit faster, a little cheaper, a little more performant. And over time, we moved from sort of, semiconductor chips to boxes made of those chips, to networks made of the boxes, to user interfaces, moving those bits around. And now we're at a point where technology is really infusing society with all kinds of things and behavioral change with it. So it's gotten to the point now where it is so integrated with society that we can take the same things that we did in technology to make products more replicable and more scalable, lower friction to use first, and then more replicable and scalable, and apply those to solutions for the whole world to make the world a better place. And XTC, when Young and I got together, I think it was 2014, it wasn't really about sustainability at the time. We really just wanted to try to drive a way to bring resources to companies all around the world that were bringing interesting technology to market. And over time, I think what's happened is that the winners of the contest every year have become more and more focused on sustainability. And Young took the contest and just stepped it up and scaled it to something of even more global proportions to try to bring these solutions to the world.
Fantastic. That's a great intro, Bill. Thank you for that. So, when we talk about sustainability now, that's kind of like what we used to call clean tech. And I just remember going back to the sort of 2000 time frame. There was a tremendous surge of clean tech investing, and we've seen a few really big stars that emerged in that era. Tesla is a great one as an example. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing to me that Tesla's market cap now is more than twice the combination of Ford and General Motors and Fiat Chrysler. I mean, can you believe that? Just unbelievable. But that's the good story. And then, of course, unfortunately, there's some less good stories. If you look at, for example, Solyndra, Abound Solar, Kior Biofuels, between them, they lost $2 billion. And unfortunately, that can happen in investing. So what's changed from clean tech 1.0 to what we now talk about when we talk about sustainable investing? Do we have a way to figure out how to build more financially successful companies so we don't see this bloodbath of lost money in venture?
Well, I think it's both the structure of the financing markets that serve sustainability, that was, I think, as you referred, called clean tech at one point, and it's the type of companies that can emerge today. I think when the verb or the phrase clean tech really started to get going in kind of the mid to late 90s, most of the projects then were around energy generation. And the capital intensity of those projects was very high. And, coming from a semiconductor background, I used to say that, wow, clean tech is sort of like semiconductors on steroids. You need sort of an order or 2 orders of magnitude more dollars per company to get a company to product market fit. And then to scale the manufacturing infrastructure was even more. And I think what's happened now is sustainability has taken on many different things. So whether it's plant-based protein, like a Beyond Meat, or it's software products that allow the creation of virtual power plants without creating a new power plant. There's all kinds of ways to make the world a better place, improve the carbon footprint, and come out with better products that meet mass consumer needs that were not opportunities really available before. Built a little bit on the foundation to some extent of some of the big capital projects in solar in the energy space. But as you mentioned, they touch a lot of different things now. So financing is more available, and the markets are broader. The ability to start companies, kind of like what happened in plane technology. So you went from capital-intensive semiconductors and boxes to a kid in a dorm room creating something like Facebook that's a user interface. So I think that trend of more granular companies has also touched that space.
I think those are excellent points. And I think, going back to a lot of the companies Pond looked at that would have fallen under the clean tech banner in that sort of time frame, early to mid 2000s, I think the number one thing that for us was a fatal error in those plans is they depended on subsidies. And the problem is subsidies depend on political will. And at least in democracies, politicians come and go, and therefore subsidies come and go. And this for us was kind of a killer. And so we tended to go toward things like energy efficiency because, seeing the capital intensity, as you said, renewables, also water, because it's possible to build a business there without subsidies. And I think what I see now is, you mentioned Beyond Meat. If you can improve profitability for farmers that operate on a razor-thin margin, or food processors or retailers, they're going to pay for it. You don't need the subsidies. If you can improve health outcomes, people will pay. If you can make cities safer, more efficient, higher quality of life, people will pay for it. So it feels like there are a whole new set of categories. Have you seen yourself any companies that you think fall under that sustainability banner that you've found very attractive and exciting?
What's interesting is that almost all companies today, if you want to succeed and succeed broadly, you have to be a company that stands for sustainability. And, I'm going to go back to your prior question just to touch on it first, which is if you look at the market value that you mentioned of a Tesla or the market value of something like Beyond Meat, capital markets have a way of signaling to you what the future needs. And on every metric, not only is Tesla a bigger market cap, on every metric of multiple of sales, multiple of earnings, because they don't really have any yet, or Beyond Meat is sort of similar. The multiples of sales are very high. And it's basically the public capital markets just shouting or hitting people in the head with a 2x4 saying, it is time. We want to fund projects like this because they will have a meaningful impact on our future. And so I think there's a lot of companies now in so many segments that are becoming increasingly viable because the consumer demand is there. It shifted from government subsidy as the driving force to consumer demand, which is far more sustainable for sustainable companies. And I think what I'm seeing now is that the next generation of humans on this planet, actually all humans, except maybe the people in our administration today, recognize that sustainability is important for the survival of our species, let alone all the other species on the planet. And because of that, the next generation in particular associates values with brand. And if you do not stand for something for a better world as a brand, people aren't interested in your product anymore. So you're seeing a complete transition of new leaders that have values imputed in what they do, whether it's making ice cream or cars or any other product.
Yeah, I think that's that's very interesting, because certainly there was a wave of idealism in Clean Tech 1.0 that was what people called values investing. It's the sort of giving back idea. And I think what's come out now, and I think it was embedded in the comments you just made, is that sustainable investing is value investing. Markets value this not because it's the flavor of the month, but because the underlying theme of sustainability is something that people deeply care about, knowing exactly, as you say, it threatens life on the planet, and therefore it's not optional. And even, when people sometimes talk about climate change and they say, well, heck, we're talking a degree or two over a century, does it really matter? Well, certainly as someone, involved in the water business, you see these terrible situations of drought and pollution, and climate change is creating these sudden climate events. We've got to deal with those today. It's not something you can wait a century to deal with. So it seems like values and value have actually converged, and that may be the meta theme of sustainable investing. But as you look at some of the very exciting companies that you've been involved in founding, it seems to me that those companies must have been riding a particular wave in order to be successful. I mean, Zoom is an excellent example. We're all sitting here using it and living on it these days. Tremendous company, but it sure seems to me like when you provided the first funding for that company, it wasn't exactly a slam dunk to build a company in this space, at least not on paper, based on the incumbents who were already there. So tell us more about that and how that might read on today's world.
Yeah, well, Zoom is such an inspiring story for every entrepreneur out there listening to this call and beyond. If you clock back, I think it was, call it 7, 8, 9 years ago. I can't actually remember the date. Eric Yuan had been running a video conferencing company, Zoom or WebEx, that had been acquired. He was one of the founding engineers at WebEx. It went public. It got acquired by Cisco. He stayed on as general manager and was running it. And simultaneous with him growing it to a very large multi-$100 million business, the cloud was coming. A total disruptive change in the way companies could deliver the digital infrastructure at scale. And he totally saw that. And I also saw that because at that time I was funding a lot of cloud companies. I had seeded Canva, which was cloud design in the face of Adobe. I had founded, as founding chairman and investor, Treasure Data, which was Hadoop on the cloud, shared infrastructure, kind of like TSMC was in semiconductors. And a lot of the other things, I was working in cloud currency around Bitcoin and other things as it was getting going. And here is Eric that is driving, at the time, more of a client server model. He had seeded me in Treasure Data. And we were talking about cloud, and he said to me, this cloud, it could change everything, and it could completely wipe me out. And I said, why? And he said, I'm running all these different software teams because every time you come to WebEx, my system has to figure out, are you a Mac? Are you a PC? Which browser do you use? Which CPU do you have? How much memory? And there's 14 or 15 different teams. When you get on a call, all those things connect to a server, and then I have to derate you and everyone else to the lowest quality video, otherwise somebody can't see. So I can guarantee you the worst quality of the largest group. And he said, that's the business model. And he said, it's in the face of cloud, somebody could create an infinitely scalable back end, and the front end becomes a skin. And then it's just going to be a lot better. And I said, well, couldn't you do that? And he said, let me think about that. And then a few weeks later, he called me and I said, are you starting a company? And he said, I think so. I said, well, count me in. I'll be your backer. And that led to the creation of Zoom. Now, the environment that you described, it was pretty hairy. I could see the cloud transition impacting, but most of venture capital at the time could not. Because here you had Cisco with a big footprint in enterprise with WebEx. You had GoToMeeting with a massive enterprise play as well. And then you had Microsoft that had just bought Skype for $8 billion and made it free, and Google with Hangouts that was free. And so as Zoom went around to try to raise money for its Series A, all the venture guys turned them down because the standard answer was, you're going to compete with Microsoft and Google that have free products? Why? And nobody funded them. And so it really took a lot of focus on a low friction user interface, a very low cost back end. And 5 years later, Emergence Capital finally funded them. But the company was already at revenue, and then Sequoia came in 7 years after the start, a year before the IPO when it was already profitable. And it really is a story that if you see it and you believe it and you have a big market that has a transition coming up that you can take advantage of to put yourself in a position as a new leader, do not give up, because great things do take time. And you have to be riding the right trends and the right wave with a great team. Get backers that believe, and you will always have a shot.
So I think I'd really like to emphasize that, Bill. What you were saying there is, you funded this company. It was based on a reimagined approach for all of the virtuous reasons you described. But it took 5 years to get venture money into the company, and 5 years in startup years is several lifetimes. So yes. That notion of gutting it out, I mean, if you go back a long, long way further, FedEx had a similar situation, where they just went forever and ever before they really kind of turned it on and everything started going in the right direction. So how does a founder know, when is the time to give up? A clinical psychiatrist who specialized in doing management, team building events, said one time to me, you have to understand that the characteristic of most successful CEOs is psychological certitude. They just know they're right. He said, unfortunately, that's the same characteristic you have of dictators. So the point is, when do you keep pushing? When do you give up? How do you know how to tell the difference?
For me, it's really about Mark, and you're right. It's about the CEO needing to do it, because investors and board members themselves can't just push somebody to stay in the game unless they just keep fueling it with infinite capital. But the CEO, I think, is in a position where he will know whether he has a product that the market wants. It's about product market fit. And I think the interesting thing for Zoom was, at the very start, it was really hard to get anyone to try the product because they already had probably WebEx GoToMeeting and, something else, Skype, downloaded on their computer. So the switching cost is very high once somebody's already in that seat. But the people that would use it, they loved it, and they switched. And it became the kind of default for a bunch of people. It was hard to charge for it, but you could tell that, one, there was product market fit if you could get people to try it, and the engagement got better and better and better as the company lowered friction to use. And so there was enough market feedback, and the real question was, what is the cost of getting the customer? Because the product was being used, but would it be really, really expensive to get someone to use it such that the model couldn't work if you couldn't charge a lot? And over time, the marketing campaigns ultimately started to work, and because it's a communications product, by definition, communications products are viral if they start to work. And so there was enough feedback where people were bringing on other people because they love the product and they communicate with their friends, and it just had to live long enough to get to a model where they could charge enough to cover the cost. And the cloud infrastructure created a totally new paradigm for delivering value at scale at low cost. And you saw that in spades as COVID started to hit. Back in December of last year, Zoom had an infrastructure set for probably 10 million daily meeting users. By February, there was demand for 200. And by April, it was 300 million. So to be able to scale from servicing 10 million daily meetings to 300 in 90 days, how hard would that have been if you were doing a client server model where you had to have a server for every set of meetings? It was with the infrastructure already there, you could basically spin it up, spin it down, and it was just much more efficient. It had kind of the elasticity of the cloud and the efficiencies that you have when you have a communications cloud. The marginal user costs you less bandwidth because you're leveraging all that was in before. So it was a natural fit for where the environment we're in today.
So what you're saying then, I think, is rather than relying on potential sources of finance to be the ultimate judges of whether your business has merit or not, particularly if it's up and running, as in the case of Zoom, you can listen to the market. You can listen to your customers. You can say, do these people really like this, or am I kidding myself? Is this the sort of lunatic fringe of early adopters, or are people really getting into this? And as you say, is the beginning of virality there? Plus the sort of fundamental health check that actually the ideas underneath this business actually make sense.
Yeah, I think it's really about customers, and you see that in everything, even with things that don't have profits, whether it's a Tesla or a TikTok. If people are using it, the money will come. And if people aren't using it, doesn't matter who the team is or how much money you have, you're just digging another scoop out of the crater in the ground that you're creating.
Yeah. But as you've been involved in so many companies, and of course, inevitably behind the wall of successes, there are all kinds of turbulent events, I'm sure, in the lives of those companies. What role have you been able to play as an investor, both with your angel hat on or with your general partner hat from a venture fund, in trying to help the team, and particularly the CEO, figure out, are we on the right path or are we not, to try to add that value to get them over the hump and into the right direction? Can you give us some stories about that?
Sure. So for all of you entrepreneurs out there, there has not been a single company I have funded ever where there wasn't a morning or two or string of mornings over 2 or 3 weeks where the CEO woke up in the morning and said, I'm not sure I should have done this. Oh my God, I'm not going to get through this. You are going to have those doubts over and over again. Just that they're part of doing startups. So don't think that that's abnormal, because it's part of the game. And I think the role that I play, one, I'm a natural optimist. So I think people tell me that I bring levity and happiness to the board meetings because I'm just wired like that. And I think when you seek out investors, you want to have an investor that is counter-cyclical to the way you think. So there are some board members that come into companies, and when you're on a high, they amplify it higher. And when you're on a low, they think the world is ending and they deepen your fear. And I'd say the better guides for you as a founding CEO are going to be people that are opposite of your sine curve. And when you're in that low, it's somebody that can come in and tell you, hey, look, it's not that bad. Just think about fixing these things. And when you're on that high that is definitely never going to be sustainable, you want somebody that's going to tell you, chill, man, like look out, because the good times, they never last forever. You just have to, make sure that you're prepared for when things go wrong. And I think if you have people that are wired like that around you, the tough times are easier. And they also prevent you from letting your ego get out of control in the hard period, in the up moments, because it's when your ego gets out of control that things go wrong. So just, counter cyclicality from your board members and investors is a great thing.
So being a source of encouragement in the bad times, as well as maybe being a source of circumspection in the good times. Yeah.
And I'd also say you want people that are, I have a phrase that, that I kind of evolved when I did a little work with Don Valentine, who had founded Sequoia. Don was on the first startup. He was a backer of the first startup I had joined called LSI Logic. And when I went into the venture business, I kind of followed him around into projects. And I'd characterize him as one of the world's most efficient thinkers. he boils things down. And he passed away last year, but he boiled things down into the one or two most important things that mattered, and all the other stuff was crap. It didn't matter. So I'd say, to the extent you can get people that can distill signal from noise, so you don't waste your time on things that don't really matter, it just helps a lot, because it's usually just one or two things that matter at any given moment that if you fix those, the tide starts to turn. And it's the people that can focus on those couple things that I think get through the infinite array of variables that is a startup. So I'd say just, somebody, and that comes with experience. So I'd say an experienced person that can cut through the noise to get to signal is so important for every startup, that you always want somebody like that around that you go to when you need it.
That's I think it's an excellent point, because ultimately what it boils down to then, I think you're saying, is focus, but focusing on the right stuff. Often you hear the stories about, a startup didn't work out, and the founders will say, well, it ran out of money. That's why it didn't work out. It's like, no, startups never run out of money. It's always, there's a failure mechanism, and it seems like the most common one is indigestion, trying to do too many things at the same time and not achieving the focus exactly like you described. Excellent point. So let's talk also, we're in a challenging time, to put it mildly, at the moment. I mean, obviously with the advent of COVID and the fact that this is bouncing around like a set of pinballs all over the planet, in the sense of, rising somewhere, going out somewhere else, coming back again somewhere else. We heard about Beijing from Lip-Bu just now. When you have a macro shock like this, the whole COVID outbreak, the riots, the major economic downturn, how does a startup approach that in such a way that they can survive it, or perhaps even benefit from it?
Actually, it's a funny thing, because I've always loved environments like this. When I look at what happened at the great financial crisis, when things hit the wall in 2009, coming out of that, it clarified the air a bit. And that's when I seeded Zoom, Canva, Treasure Data, Wish. It was the perfect time to be a startup. And if you go to the period that we were just in before all this stuff started to happen, we were in a very headsy market. Yeah, it felt like it was easy to raise money if you had a decent team and a good idea. But what was happening was, we were, as startups, all entering horse races where you had to pedal to the metal, try to figure out what you're going to build. Competition for people was very high. It was very expensive to build up a team in terms of a payroll. And then if you had a product, you had to overspend to try to get share of mind. And it was very, very expensive to set up a business. One of the beauties of the environment in which Zoom, Canva, Wish, and others got set up was they didn't have to waste resources. They could just focus on building a product that worked, getting low friction to usage, and then experiment in terms of what's working to get people to use it more, to drive replicability. And then once they had that, to know how to build an infrastructure that could scale so that you could grow really fast. Trying to do that in a horse race pace is a very different game than building it thoughtfully with air cover, to kind of build and operate, and also hire in people that don't have false expectations. I think the thing that you get in horse race markets like we were in is a lot of people that want to join because they think they can make quick money. And you're far, far better off attracting a team where people want to do what they want to do and build a product that they care about with people that they want to work with. That kind of a fabric is so much stronger and so much more durable in good and bad times. It gives startups a great advantage. So I had actually started to slow down my investing in the last 18 months. And now I'm actually very aggressively looking to put together those kinds of companies again, because we have that window in front of us right now where a lot of human resources are available. The people that will come into projects, they care. So they're in it for more than money. So the power of the dollars is a lot higher. And the available bandwidth for the investors that come in is a lot higher. So I think in a horse race market, you can't get anyone's time. So I think the little foundations that are built today are going to be really, really good for companies that emerge at scale 7 to 8 years from now.
I think it's a great point. And if you couple that along with maybe, you talked about when Zoom got going, the advent of cloud and what that enabled in terms of a consistent user experience was just enormously important. What about what's happening in regards to, COVID and so on, particularly COVID? You talk about this notion of people needing to get out there looking at tons and tons of data. Do you think there are underlying things going on now that naturally will make certain kinds of startups be more successful? I mean, could it, for example, rely on things like data and AI, which seems to be a major theme at the moment?
Sure. And I briefly touched on kind of waves of technology. When I moved out to Silicon Valley in the 80s, we were in this wave of automating physics, moving from vacuum tubes to little things the size of your fingernail that moved electrons around more efficiently in a small form factor instead of a light bulb. And then there was therefore the shrinkage when you could build things on that of a second wave, which was communications equipment, computers, electronic boxes that you'd stitch together to do networks. And then the third wave was the transmission networks themselves. The phone companies got digitized. You moved from circuit switch networks to packet switch networks, where instead of like those old videos where you'd have the operator sticking a cable into a wall to connect a call from New York to Boston to Rhode Island to another switching center to California, a bunch of wires, you could take the wire and leave it on and just chop up the bits with little header packets so you could put lots of calls onto that same line. So that was the third wave that was a big wave for venture. The fourth wave was, what do you put on those networks? So the Facebooks, the Googles, the LinkedIns, whatever those digital companies may be, they're really just user interfaces on that cloud. So they're ones and zeros coming off a page. So how do you create a user interface to make it useful? That was wave 4. And wave 5 is what we're still in, which I'd call the data science wave. The companies that won their categories were very good at recording, using, leveraging, understanding the data of their users to know what to do to marginally get more customers. And that's produced a whole giant wave of companies, whether they're things like Splunk or what Treasure Data was, or anything in this kind of data science world that includes blockchain and other things like that. So I think where we are today, we're at the 3rd or 5th year of a 30-year wave. Like the telecommunications was a long wave and semiconductors were a long wave. And we're just kind of at the start, the first couple innings of a 30-year wave where data represents physical things and creates massive efficiencies. Think about what is an Uber. Uber is a data science cloud with a bunch of cars on the end of it. And they're in a way not doing something too dissimilar from what a Walmart was in retail compared to a JCPenney. If you think about JCPenney and Sears and all those companies going out of business, they're basically piles of inventory purchased by subjective buyers that say, oh, give me 50,000 of these. I'll put them in a store. Maybe they'll sell at Christmas. Walmart is a data science cloud where everything has a little tag on it that sits on this cloud. And when it moves around, it's recorded at the point of sale. And they're very efficient on the inside. If there's too much inventory in California and not enough in Boston, it moves. So it's just a very, very capital light model compared to the old ones that doesn't have the inventory risk. And that's getting applied now to cars, to rooms. Airbnb is a bunch of rooms on the end of a data science cloud. It's happening to currency. A Bitcoin is a little piece of value on a cloud. It's happening to digital cats, crypto kitties. It's happening really to anything. So Zoom, what are we? We're a data science cloud where we have been virtualized and we're sitting on an endpoint and we don't have to get on the plane anymore. So I think all physical goods, all digital pieces of value, all units of things that have to connect to each other are now represented digitally, attached to a framework. And the molecules, instead of the molecules having to physically move, the representation of the molecule moves. So we're bringing the efficiency that email did to wipe out faxes and telexes to the whole world of physical goods and virtual goods. It's something maybe 4 orders of magnitude larger than what, the communications networks were in terms of just abstracting phone calls. Now we're abstracting money, we're abstracting cars, we're abstracting houses, we're abstracting the physical world.
Outstanding. Well, but now here's the thing. So what you described in terms of how all of that world evolved in those steps, the layers as you described it, kind of all fits under the giant bucket of, should we say, information technology. But then suddenly now with this wealth of data and AI technologies being applied to things like drug discovery, things in the genomic or biotech world, is that a world that you've had any involvement in? And would you invest, potentially in a company that's in the bio area where maybe you haven't had that sort of hands-on experience operationally?
Absolutely. I was one of the original seed investors in Ubiomi and Color Genomics. And I am looking at things in that space. And I think it's exactly what you say. Because information technology has become part of really everything we do, the portion of that brings efficiency to those kinds of companies in either the analysis, the development, the categorization of the data that is around those companies is a game changer in that sector in the same way that cloud was for video conferencing. So there are some companies that do their drug discovery in very old sort of manual trial and error ways, and they just happen to have been around for a long time with giant teams and multiple teams to throw a lot of resources at it, and they have the channels to support stuff like that and prior cash flow. But I think there are newer methods that are evolving everywhere where the experimentation is just made a lot more efficient by, sort of like the similar methods to what A/B testing were for the digital companies. You just get a couple orders magnitude more impact out of the dollars you spend by correlating your data, prior data from other places, open source data from other repositories, and the ability now to take a Hadoop infrastructure, which is a quick thing on Hadoop. I think when the world moved from big instances of databases like an Oracle on big machines to Google and Yahoo building data centers to serve the world, the nature of computing completely changed. And you went from these single linear instances to orchestras with a conductor of many little blade servers that could expand or contract as a group to service problems, and the nature of data changed. So you went from big databases to tweets and JPEGs and all kinds of like ambient data from which there was information, but it was hard to read in an Oracle system. So Google created GFS, Yahoo created Hadoop, open sourced it. That became the basis for which the Facebooks and the Twitters and the LinkedIns and the Zyngas built their infrastructure to then win. All of that is now available off the cloud from Treasure Data or from Redshift at Amazon to any company. And so now we have this world where 1,000 flowers can bloom and use the same techniques and advantages, whether they're in medical or drug discovery or clinical data or in plain old web. So I think it's all happening to other parts of the economy now.
Excellent. So I really would like to invite the audience, send in your questions, put them in the chat, or follow any other instructions you've had previously, but ask away. Be very happy to comment. I see one here regarding how attractive are sustainable solutions to investors. Do you usually look at the impacts that solutions have, for example, less CO2 or energy, or the dollar value of savings to customers? In other words, both may have to be there, but is there a relative importance?
These days you really need both. I think, when Silicon Valley really got going, it was really only about price performance and saving cost and improving performance of kind of computer gear or hardware things. And as technology moved out of the technology companies serving technology companies to technology-powered products serving the masses, the world also moved to something where, as we discussed before, brand mattered and social or environmental impact mattered. to the ability for a company to sell. And the brand value in B2B was not so important. You know, it was important to a small segment of customers, but a lot of these companies, people didn't know who they were unless they were a tech company. Now everybody is aware of technology companies, and the brand really does matter. So the sustainable message that goes with your brand is important. And I think the other thing that's happening is the authenticity of the message matters a lot too, because the world is a lot more transparent today. And while fake news can carry things a little bit, people check. And if you take a stance that people can pick on because you're not really true to your word, you're going to get it. I mean, the markets are going to come after you and call you out. So I think if you want to stand for something great and have a CO2 impact, you better measure it and know that it's true before you start tweeting about it. And I think you have to have one of those messages if you're going to stand out in a world where every other brand you're competing with is doing something good for this planet and you're not. Great
point. So Bill, look, you've got a lot of experience geographically as well, not just in the different sectors you've been involved in all these different stages of companies, but in different parts of the world. You know, we've had more than 2,400 companies apply to this year's XTC competition from 87 countries. So which countries would you look at and cite as being emerging places where some interesting stuff has happened that maybe not quite on everybody else's radar?
You know, I have had a tremendous amount of luck in Australia for whatever reason, you know, whether it's Canva at, you know, it's 4 to 6 billion valuation now, or Safety Culture that just got raised at $1 billion, or, you know, Blackbird Ventures, which I see that they're on fire too. Their first fund was 9X as a fund. But that market has been tremendous for me. And Japan has been a great place for me. You know, I started a company called IPinfusion there that's kind of the main source of routing software that's Linux-based for comm equipment out there. And Treasure Data was founded out of Japan. Those two markets have been great. There's a lot of activity now happening out of the EU, particularly in the UK, around fintech. And I think there's obviously been a lot in China, but it's been harder to navigate the legal framework there for me. So I'd say, you know, we're at a really interesting point in time. I think when I look back to the mid-90s, I started an ISP in 1995-ish, and I bought 4 routers. John Sidgmore of then UUNet wrote a check, and I stuck these routers in Taiwan and set up a little backbone there and connected it to the United States. And then one of the first privately owned ISPs out of Taiwan. And my thesis at the time was this internet thing is going to make every software engineer in Bangladesh equal to the one in San Jose or anywhere in the world. And I was only partially right, but I was really wrong on one front. The knowledge availability was there, but what happened was the fluidity of the capital markets and the legal framework in the US for creating startups caused every good engineer somewhere else on the planet to wake up in the morning and say, I should be in Silicon Valley. And then they got sucked in through the internet to San Jose or San Francisco. So it concentrated the resources briefly. But I think what's happened now is the world has gotten flatter. The requirements to come to the USA under the Trump administration have gotten harder. There's a lot of structural change now where the pods in different areas of the world, whether it's Sydney or Perth or Melbourne in Australia or London in the UK, the recognition of consumer-based technologies being everywhere and the ability for somebody to start a company in their dorm room like Mark Zuckerberg did has gotten easier and easier with the cloud. So there are now startups everywhere. So it took a little while, but it's like that Genesis project in the movie Star Trek, you know, where Spock goes in and he pulls a reactor core out and he dies, and then they got to bring him back to life. So they use this project where all of a sudden you see this stream of green and blue in a black world come over the world. And we are seeing that today. The flourishing of entrepreneurs around the world is like nothing I've seen before. So it's beautiful to see.
That's phenomenal, Bill. But let me ask you this, and if you could put your Charles River hat on, if you like, in other words, an institutional venture fund versus an individual angel. What about proximity to your portfolio companies? I mean, is it practical to expect the Silicon Valley VC to invest in, for example, in Australia or in Japan or in a completely different geography?
That was another thing where people thought I was nuts. I got a lot of people telling me I was nuts to fund a video conferencing company back in 10 years or whatever it was when Zoom got going. And when I started seeding things in Australia, I seeded Canva in Perth, Australia, which literally is exactly on the opposite side of the world. And to get to Perth, you have to take a 16-hour flight to Sydney, and then you get on another plane and fly another 6 hours to Perth. And here I was backing a cloud design company that wanted to compete with Adobe, with basically just a recent college grad. And people were like, "You're nuts. How is that ever going to work?" And when I started in this business, Don Valentine used to say, "Never fund a company more than an hour away from your office," because you didn't need to, because they were all here. And that I remember that alarm bell ringing in my head when I was deciding to fund these companies in Australia, because I learned a lot from Don, and he's really good. But my instinct was telling me, Mark Zuckerberg was able to do it in his dorm room in Boston, and he did move to California to scale it. Why can't, in a world where any kid can sit in front of a computer screen and start to design, why can't that happen somewhere else? Why is a dorm room in Boston any different than Perth? It's not. And so the question is, can you scale them? But the starting wasn't scary to me at all. And I think I also had this tremendous advantage 7 years ago of using Zoom. And so how people live today online, I was already doing that. So I was telling Eric Yuan just, about a month ago, 7 or 8 years ago, when I moved online to Zoom, and I had this lifestyle where I could literally travel around the world and do all my work from wherever I was, I didn't think that there would be 300 million people that followed me someday. But I think now we're in this world where it is socially acceptable to have a one-on-one to get to know somebody over video. It wasn't before. And I think the competition in venture in Silicon Valley has gotten so high that the value proposition in terms of, what you pay for a startup in the Valley at that early stage is so out of whack compared to what it is elsewhere that that you can do wonders starting companies in other geographies and then, scaling them up here if you need to.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One thing I was going to say, one of our portfolio companies, Fluence, that I chair currently and have done for the last 10 years now, was an Israeli startup with 3 people in it at the time in the water space. Once their innovation got working, we took it public in Australia, which is like, wait a second, that's a bit of a non sequitur, but it turned out to be a good place to find patient capital. The management team is now driven out of New York, but the major commercial focus is in China. So how do you figure that out? Well, we never would have seen that ahead of time, but it just evolved in that way. So that notion of kind of a global footprint can just kind of happen to a company sometimes.
Hey, Richard, Bill, there's a question from Monal Parmar. Her question is, for early revenue companies, what speed of growth is interesting, and how much revenue would you want to see after 3 years?
So let me drill down on that question. Went 3 years from start of product or 3 years from start of company. So not that you have to answer that, but I think it's useful, obviously, 3 years into a startup's life to have some revenue. If you don't have something, and it depends on which category, if you're building a semiconductor chip, no, it's going to take 5 to 7 years or more. But if you're doing something that is a web-based product where you can get customer feedback, if you don't have usage by 3 years, something's very wrong. Maybe you're going to have to pivot or something like that. But 3 years into a product's life, you should be starting to grow pretty fast. And 100% or more growth rates, I think, would be in users, maybe not revenue, but in users would be important to see. And I'd boil things down to 3 very simple things you have to do. You have to find a use case that people want, and you want to lower the friction. So 1, lower friction to use so a lot of people can use it. 2, once you've got users, show that it's useful for more than one person. So how can you replicate that across many users? And then 3, once you have that, you just want to make sure that you can blow it out and get a lot of users without killing your cost structure. So then there's a scalability part, which is both what is your cost of delivering that product, and also what is your cost of acquiring new customers. If you solve those 3 things, that's all you have to do, you will have high value to investors.
Thank you, Bill. We got another question from Brandon Matthews. He's asking that we make insurance work via mobile for emerging consumers in places like Myanmar and Nepal. That means we have a foot in the insurance world, another foot in digital mobile, and the third in frontier markets. I find investors are fine with 1 or 2 out of the 3. I know that we need a digital first investor in our next round, but I find they're daunted by how weird insurance is. Any advice for pitching to an investor that might not immediately understand why I think they're a good fit?
Yeah, so the triple play that you described of layered risk, it's not for everybody, but there are some people that will absorb that. And you're right, it's a question of how you explain what that risk is, because the more layered risks you have, like if you have let's say a 5% chance of succeeding and 95% chance of failing, if you multiply out, 0.05 times 0.05 times 0.05, it's, 0.0125. It gets smaller, right? So you have to figure out what are the risks in front of me and how do I absolve those risks with a little capital? And if you can, then it'll work. So I tell a lot of companies when I start them at early stages to go to a whiteboard and write the numbers 1 through 10 and list what are the 10 things that could kill me and put me out of business, and to rank order those. And if you take the venture capital and you apply them one by one against those 10 and they're gone, by definition, you have a company that's alive. So think through that. How do you efficiently apply your capital, get rid of those risks? And you are identifying one right here. The insurance industry, I'm daunted by that too at times, because I know it's a big, messy industry that's totally inefficient and should be changed. But it's also a regulated business. It's very complex. And the timing of when things like that start to come unglued and remake themselves is really hard to call. The telecommunications business felt that way in the early 90s until the Telecom Deregulation Act of 1994 or 96, whenever it was around that time, 94, I think it was. And so insurance is one of these things where, like banking, people have busted their pick as institutional venture capitalists for 25 years. And somehow it never seems to get better. So if there is a structural change ahead, like Eric Yuan articulated cloud would change video conferencing to me, if you can see something where you know that the ground is going to shift and it opens up a new opportunity for new leaders, be very articulate about why that is going to happen and when it's going to happen and what you can do to take advantage of that shift. The other things you mentioned about emerging markets, Richard had asked me, where have I liked to do business in other countries? It's tended to be in countries where the regulatory framework is understandable and the rule of law for me is easily digestible. I think Apple tests products in Australia and New Zealand. That kind of legal framework was not hard for me to digest. Japan is a place of rules and law and order. I didn't think I was going to get ripped off there. Countries in the emerging market countries and companies in those, if an investor has to understand that risk profile on top of the product market risk, on top of the industry risk, it's a set of layers that not everybody's going to want to, chew into. So you're going to have to figure out how to box those and explain what those risks are.
Thank you, Bill.
I guess if I could just add to that, maybe Rajiv, I think.
Yeah, good.
Excellent points, Bill. And I guess I would summarize it with something I often say, and some of you may have heard me say this before, that a lot of entrepreneurs are trying to figure out, how do I get my business funded? I just need money. And I often say to entrepreneurs, you know what you really want is the right amount of money from the right VCs for the right business plan. And you need to unpack each of those. You obviously make sure you raise more than you need. That's the obvious one. But the other thing is, rather than just, should we say, putting it bluntly, fooling someone into giving you money, you want to find a VC that's passionate about what you're doing and really believes in it and can really add value to it. And finally, that if people listen to your plan and you just get hundreds and hundreds of no's, maybe there is something wrong with it. And I'm not saying that to Brandon specifically, but I'm saying sometimes you just have to listen to the music, because maybe a few small changes in that plan turns a real tough business into something that would really pop.
Thank you, Richard. So Bill, I'm curious, you've seen so many pitches from entrepreneurs, startups, VCs, working with them. And we heard today from Tahi and Young and Jerry and others, yourself, that you want to catch the wave. But what happens if you don't catch the wave? And how do you stay true to it? How do you prevail to catch the next one?
So I'm going to answer that two ways. One is whether you want to stay with the same wave or whether you want to move to a different one. Because I think it's there are some cases where the wave that everyone thinks will come never really happens. Pen computing was like that in the 90s with Momenta and Go and EO and all that stuff. And then there's sometimes that they just happen to you have to pivot and go somewhere else. And I'd say it's really a kind of a question of timing. And I use, I'm a waterman. I kite surf and do things a lot on the water. And so I use these surfing analogies. If you think about a wave kind of cruising across the ocean, there's only three places you can be. You can either be behind it, in front of it, or right on it. And the timing matters a lot. If you're behind a wave that has already gone past you, there is no physical way to swim up the back of a wave and come into the front. Too late. And there's other people riding it. So if the market has already formed and it's going and there's no structural change to take advantage of, move, pivot to a different, drop back. And like you were asking, Rajiv, just drop back, reconstitute yourself, and hit the next one. If you're in front of it, there's a phrase that says, being early is a lot like being wrong. And you're paddling and you're paddling and you're paddling and raising money and your team is tired and you're telling them it's going to happen and nothing happens and everybody quits. So the question there is, how do you sustain yourself without burning out if you're too early and not be the person that paddled themselves out and the wave goes by with some other kid riding it? So what you want to do there is you have to adjust your burn rate to the situation at hand. Keep it light. Don't overextend with too many people, burning too much money that becomes unsustainable. And then if you're really lucky, you'll know, because sometimes you're on that board and you paddle once and you're moving and you just stand up. That happens every once in a while because it was the right place at the right time. And if you can hang out there until that wave hits. Zoom got hit in the face with the 2x4 of luck with, the COVID crisis, Canva too, all these things, they hit at the right time. So it's really a question of feeling the market and feeling that product market fit. And if you've been trying new products out there and they're just not taking, or they're taking in a way that they will not get good long-term engagement and grow, it may not be a good market at that right time. So either drop it and move somewhere else, or keep tweaking, like Richard was saying, until you hit that resonance chord.
Constant adjustment and adaptability. Thank you so much, Bill. Richard, thank you so much. And with that, we conclude the sessions for today, and we hope you enjoyed all the sessions. Thank you for joining us.